I didn't plan for that. I want you to know that choosing a sermon for today was really difficult. I had chosen it in advance, but how do you close out a worship service? And I thought about all the different scriptures that I could use, stories that I could tell, and themes that I could use to wrap up this final worship with a nice little bow in this setting. But then I realized this isn't the end of Fuel. Sure, it's the last worship, but from here, Fuel in this room, they'll go back to the original time, and they'll become a Sunday school. And if you can believe that, it'll be even less formal than this gathering, which is actually the way the church began. And who knows? Maybe that's how it begins again. So instead of giving you a scripture and then a sermon that gives you closure, I decided to give you a sermon that leaves you with one question. A question that my hope and prayer is that you never forget. I didn't start with the scripture because I didn't want to read a scripture, and I wanted to tell the scripture as a story in a bit of a different way than you're used to. So if you actually read ahead, read the verse, or you know the story, don't spoil it for your neighbor. And when I say I'm going to tell this story in a different way, I'm going to add characters to the story that were probably there originally, present in the original story, but never talked about when it was written down. I'm going to tell you the story in a more modern context, so it's easier for us to relate to. And I'm hoping that this story reflects somehow in your life, because I know it reflects daily in mine. In fact, if someone were to ask me, or to tell me, you only get one scripture to preach on for the rest of your life, this one would be it. Because for me, it says a lot of things. It says who God is. And it says who we are. And it talks about our relationship between God and us. And the scripture's from Luke. And now Luke's a gospel that was written for the benefit of the poor and the oppressed and the disenfranchised. It was not written for the rich or the privileged or those with means or power. But it wasn't written to the poor or the oppressed. It was written to the people in power, like us, to remind us of their struggle, to bestow in us compassion and empathy for their lives. So the story. There was a family. Mother, father, 2 daughters, 2 sons. It was a simple family. They weren't rich, but they were fairly well off. There was always food on the table. They had a modest house, and they had enough land that they had a nice sized farm, and they even had a dozen or so employees that would come work the land and help with the animals. Enough about that. You probably want to know more about the children. The youngest girl, she was a beautiful spark of a girl who painted rainbows on everything. And her beautiful big brown eyes and her charming smile kept her from getting in trouble for painting rainbows on everything. She looked up to her brother, who was just a few years older than her. But he marched to the beat of a different drummer. He daydreamed of far-off lands with experiences and lights, scents and smells that his small town would never be able to give to him. He didn't always get along with his siblings. In fact, he was often jealous of them, even though he was really his mother's favorite. His older brother was the workhorse of the family, and he was the most like his father. He was loyal, and he did everything without question, everything his father asked. And he never talked back to his parents. He was always by his father's side, and everyone in the town knew that one day he would be the one that would inherit the farm and the business. and what little wealth they had. Now, the oldest of the children was arguably the smartest of all the children. Not just because of her age or her experience, but because she was a voracious reader. And she had a photographic memory, and she would often give quotes of people that even the smartest people in the town had never heard of. Everyone was impressed by her wit and intellect. Now, this family had for many years, they had a ritual that they would eat breakfast and dinner together. They would start their day together, they would talk about their plans, and they would encourage each other, and they would help each other prepare for the day. At dinner, they would come back together and they would talk about how their day had actually happened. And if someone had a bad day, this was the time that they would find comfort with each other. Now, over the past few weeks and months, the younger boy had been getting in trouble at school. He had been rude to mom and dad constantly. He even slammed the door of his room a lot. Most recently, he had slammed the door of his room right in his little sister's face. Now, she wasn't hurt, but all she wanted to do was know if he wanted to play. The parents just figured this was a phase. After all the other kids had gone through this. Well, not really. The oldest son was always really reserved, so it was not so bad. The oldest daughter, well, she never quite recovered. She could roll her eyes so hard you would think they would just fly over her head. One morning, the kids were especially difficult this morning because they were hard to get out of bed. The eggs were runny. The toast was burnt. And they even ran out of bacon before everybody was served. All the children were in rare form this morning as they ate their breakfast. And as always, they started to go around the table and talk about their plans for the day. But when it came time for the younger son to talk, he just sulked. The family waited for him to speak. They waited patiently. Silently. And they anticipated his eventual response. "You can all just go to hell," he said as he slammed his chair back and stood up. He said it to all of them, but he really meant it for his parents. Pointing at his father, he said, "I wish you were dead. I just wish I could have what would be mine when you die, and I can go away. I can leave this crappy family in this podunk town." His father stood up and left the room. His mother tried to look strong, and she fought back tears as she gave the last bit of bacon to the youngest daughter, hoping that it would just keep her quiet. But it didn't work. "Where will you go, Bubby?" asked the little girl innocently, not really understanding the gravity of what was happening at this moment. His response was, "I don't know and I don't care, just anywhere other than here." The older brother chimed in and said, "You don't know how good you have it. You should never talk to mom and dad like that." And as he said this, the father returned, placed a manila envelope and a set of keys down in front of the younger boy, and the father sat back down and sipped his coffee. The youngest son took the keys and the envelope and he stormed out towards his bedroom. The older daughter rolled her eyes as she always did, and she just wished that he would have kept his mouth shut. After all the children but the younger brother had gone off to school, the mother went into the room and she silently watched him pack his 2 suitcases. One was his normal worn brown suitcase, and the other one was a smaller pink suitcase with wheels. As his mother noticed this, he explained to her that his little sister had brought it in as she left for school. Now, time passed right in front of the mother's eyes. She remembered when he was just a baby. Her baby boy. She remembered his first steps, his first words, first loose tooth, first grade, first baseball game. All those firsts. And now this. She put her head in her hands and cried silently. She heard the zip of him closing the suitcase and looked up to watch her baby boy walk out, and she barely recognized him now And she couldn't figure out if that was because she was looking through a wall of tears or because his anger had just changed who he was. He took the car and the money that his father had given him and he headed out of town. He went through several other small towns before he got to the city, and he stopped to have lunch. He sat down at the restaurant and he ate, and he thought of where he would go. He hadn't really put a lot of thought into this because he never thought he would get this far. But finally he felt like an adult. He felt free. And for the first time he was a little scared because he didn't know what to do. He decided to go west. He drove all day and all night. And when he got tired, he stopped to get a hotel room. But because he didn't have a credit card, they wouldn't rent him a room. So he had to go to the place on the edge of town that was not quite as nice. He ended up in a pretty shady motor lodge, actually, and they gave discounts for weekly and monthly stays. The room was dirty, and there were bugs. There were live ones and dead ones. And he couldn't sleep. He was just so on edge. And so he sat there and he thought, what do I want? He finally looked in the envelope to see what was in there, and he found about $1,500 in cash and a checkbook. And the check register said there were over $3,000 in that account. And his name was on the checks. His parents had evidently set this up when he was just a baby. He also found a small envelope with his name on it and in his father's handwriting, and he slipped that into the suitcase and forgot about it. So $4,500 in a pretty good car. That's a good start for a world of possibility. Now, I'm not going to tell you what city he went to because I don't want you driving there and getting in trouble. But he went and found a cheap apartment. After all, he didn't want to spend all his money at once, and the apartment made the hotel look like a palace. He bought some furniture, and several times while he lived there, his tiny apartment was broken into and everything nice that he had was stolen. He was even robbed a couple of times in the city. And one time they beat him up pretty bad. And there was this get-rich-quick scheme that he fell for, which didn't just cost him a lot of money, but one of his best friends that he had made too. Between being robbed and not being able to find decent work, the money eventually ran out. Now, I'm not saying jobs were hard to come by, but even when he lied on the applications and said he had experience or he had finished high school, they didn't hire him. Eventually, the money completely ran out, and to pay the rent, he sold the car. But he bought a bicycle, so at least he didn't have to walk. He did odd jobs around the neighborhood that he lived in, and it covered the rent for a while. And when he would get really far behind, he would go to the day laboring place where people would go to get work for the day. He'd get hired every once in a while. Maybe he'd make $50 for some backbreaking work. Very seldom he would get $100, maybe more. But he never really had worked more than 2 days in a row from this place. It had been several years since he had been home, and he didn't think about his parents a lot, but when he did, those were the times when he was the most hungry or the most lonely. Well, this was one of those days that he was both hungry and lonely. He was cleaning some stables and some chicken houses, and it was nasty, demeaning work, not just because of what it was, but these people had let the work pile up for so long. It was so horrible. You could smell it from a mile away, and 2 miles away if the wind blew just right. He kept thinking how nice his family had it, how nice the family farm was back home. He thought about the employees of the farm and how they always seemed happy. How they would get a bonus every now and then, and they never once looked hungry. He wished he could have their job or maybe just even a shower. See, his water had been cut off and his electricity had been cut off and he was behind in his rent. And he was desperate for money, and these people had offered him $500 to work for the entire week. But this was day 2. He wished he could go home just to work as a hired hand for his father, but he knew that he had destroyed that chance that one morning. He knew that he would never, ever be welcomed back. Not even if he begged just to do the dirty work. Anything, he thought, could be better than this. So that night, as he climbed out of the back of the pickup truck after a long day of backbreaking work, he went to get his bike and he saw the chain had been cut. And his bike was gone. So he had to walk home, and He walked all the way home, and by the time he got into the apartment complex, it was dark and his feet hurt. And he didn't look forward to going back into that little empty apartment with no power and no water. But as he rounded that final turn, he noticed something right outside his apartment. All his stuff had been thrown out onto the ground, littered among the grass and out into the parking lot. It looks like his landlord had finally gotten tired of waiting. Now, they didn't exactly do things the legal way at his apartment complex. And as he looked for his stuff, he found that all of the things of value were now gone. And everything had been gone through. He was exhausted physically. He was exhausted mentally and emotionally. And he started to cry as he grabbed up his clothes. He started shoving them into that pink suitcase that no one wanted. And as he packed it, he found this envelope that his father had left him and had shoved into the suitcase, and he had forgotten. And he just lost it. He fell to the ground. He was sobbing, crying. He decided he would open it. Now, back home, things had changed over the last several years. The oldest daughter, she was married. She lived in another city, and she was actually getting settled into her first job after law school. She would come home for special occasions, and she would call from time to time, and she never forgave her brother for what he did. The mother had cried for what seemed like a month, and it took over a year before she could even walk back into her boys' room. She kept the room exactly the same, and she would go in there occasionally and sit alone after everyone went to bed. The older boy pretty much ran the family farm now. The father was retired and spent much of his time sitting on the porch, drinking tea and throwing a tennis ball for the family dog. Now, the family dog, the youngest girl, had brought home one day because she figured since her parents were now retired that they needed someone to keep her company. The older brother was always gone and she was in school. It only made sense. She was that age now where her attitude started to get the best of her. But she always took a couple of extra breaths when she got mad. And from time to time, she would even count to 10. And if that didn't work, she would count to 100. Because she swore to herself she would never do what her brother had done to that family. Now, it was a hot, humid day. It was the kind that makes you sweat just thinking about it. And I don't mean sparkle. I mean sweat. The father thought this as he was sitting in his chair on the porch. The tennis ball was at his feet. The mother and the youngest daughter had gone to town to take the dog to the vet, and they wouldn't be home till later. And he sat there alone in this heat, thinking, well, I could just go inside and cool off. But the porch was his place, where he could think, and so that day he sat there and thought. And his thoughts went from what he would do tomorrow to what he did last week, and just like they always did, they went back to what had happened that day. And he shook his head as if to shake that memory out of his head, and he looked down the road that he had looked down since he was a young man. And he thought, you know, I used to could see all the way to the end of the driveway, but I can't anymore. And I'm not going to wear glasses. But as he looked, he could swear he saw a man on that road. And he stood up almost like he could zoom in on the image, but that didn't quite work. It was obscured by heat and dust, and he could make out a figure walking on that dusty road. The father stood there for a second trying to comprehend what he was seeing. The mailman had already been through. Besides, he always drives. The farm workers and the older son, well, they're in the fields. And they'd be back later to get their checks. But certainly, there was a man walking toward his house. And finally, his mind flooded with the hope, with the possibility that maybe this man was someone he hoped desperately he would see, someone who he had hoped to see for years, someone who he had feared was dead. All he could see in the distance was a man dragging a suitcase, a pink suitcase. And he ran down the steps, almost falling down. His agility wasn't what it was when he was younger, and neither was his ability to run, but he gave it everything he had. He ran until he thought his heart was going to explode and his lungs were on fire, but he was not going to give up, and he was only halfway there. And the man who was walking in the distance saw this, and at first he seemed to slow down, even hang his head. But then eventually he started to pick up his pace and run towards the father. And as they got closer, the man dragging the pink suitcase, he opened his mouth to speak. Just as that first word was going to come out, he was tackled to the ground by a weeping old man, sobbing, hugging his son. And eventually they got up, they cried, and they hugged each other, and then they looked at each other. And when they looked at each other, emotion would just pour over them, and they would start crying again and hugging each other even tighter than before. After a bit of this, one of the work trucks started to come down the road. And then another. And another. And they slowed as they approached the two men, and the first truck stopped. And the passenger got out. And the old man pointed and said, "Quick, drive back to the field. Find the largest cattle you can find, slaughter it, and bring all the meat back here. I'll pay you overtime, just go." The passenger hesitated for a moment, and the old man said, "Go!" And he got back in the truck, and it was kind of a sight to see a truck trying to turn around on this small road with other trucks waiting behind it. Eventually they got past the traffic jam, and the truck started to file back towards the house. And the one was off towards the field. The two men turned and began walking towards the house, not willing to let go of one another. And then the car came. There was a car, and it started to come up the driveway. And it was the wife and the daughter, the younger daughter. And they saw these two men walking, and the mother was thinking, well, he never walks out this far. Something must be happening. And she couldn't quite tell. One looked kind of like her husband. The other one she didn't recognize. So as she pulled up, she lowered the window, and she could see this tear-stained face of her husband, and then this other man who looked familiar, but she couldn't quite. And she slammed the car into park, and she got out and she ran around the car, and she hollered at the daughter, and she says, "Go to the house and get a pitcher of tea and a wet washcloth." The girl was startled by her mom's urgency, so she just did what she told, not knowing why this person was so special and why her father was crying and her mother was upset. And she did what she was asked, and as she came out of the house, she met them at the steps, and she offered this stranger a glass. And while her mother took the washcloth, of course, mother started cleaning his face. She had never seen her parents like this. And then she looked down, and she saw the suitcase. Quietly, she backed away and went into the house. And eventually the older brother came home too, not seeing this huddle of his parents on the steps. He got closer to the house, and before he could know what's going on, this stranger stood up from his parents and walked towards his brother. The father following behind at first, but then stepping between. The father said to the older brother, "Look who's come home, your brother, my youngest son. I thought he was dead for so long. I told a couple of men to go kill a cow and bring the meat back so we can cook. Tell the other workers to stay. We'll feed them. We have to celebrate." The older son was infuriated. "This boy, your son, wished you were dead. You gave him what was his, and then he went away. He probably spent everything on drugs and women. How dare you welcome him back and hold a celebration? You've never thrown a celebration, not even for me when I took over the farm." The father looked at his older son perplexed. He says, "But what's mine has always been yours. But your brother, who I thought was dead is alive. So, who are you? Who in this story do you identify with? Now, you and I both know who we think we're supposed to identify with in the story. But let's be honest with ourselves. Who are you in this story? Who are you? Are you coming to the celebration? Are you happy? Are you excited? Or are you hurt? Even mad? Or did you write this whole thing off mentally a long time ago and move away, at least, not following what was going on, or even caring about the situation? See, the world, it goes on. The world always goes on. And sometimes we identify with one of these characters and sometimes another. And maybe sometimes we don't understand or identify with any of them, and that's okay too. I'm not going to unpack this one for you. I want you to think about it. Pray about it. And maybe after the block party, maybe after a couple of weeks have gone by, maybe when the Fuel Sunday School gets going pretty good, or maybe after the spin worship at the Roxy starts, maybe some other time. Get back to me. Because this is important. It's more important than you know. Who are you?